Hello, this is video 4 out of 5 for the debriefing of my second CRISP lecture, the one on Spanish verb conjugation with special reference to paisa. This video covers Appendix B of the handout, which starts on page 43. And that appendix is a very brief and incomplete overview of what I have in mind for what I'm calling here, following some of the traditional literature and my A-level grammar textbook for Spanish, the Pretérito grave, also known as Spanish strong verbs. And I've got a table in 135 here, which contains, as far as I know, all of the relevant roots. Any omissions are accidental. And I say roots because many of these have derivatives that are built on them, which have the same properties. And in fact, one of these roots, the one that's roughly translated as juice, as in reduce or deduce, produce, has no bare form. It always has at least one prefix. So this table, just to walk you through how it's set out, you've got the infinitive of the verb here. This column contains the first person singular subjunctive present form, which is informative for reasons that will become clear. In this column here, you've got the third person plural preterite, and this column on the far right here shows you that the paita morpheme also holds for all of these guys, right? Because what's in this column here is the stem of the imperfect / future subjunctive, and it's just the third person plural preterite minus ron in every single case. Now, there's various bits of shading here. I'd better explain what those mean. But first, here are some properties that all Pretérito grave roots have. They're in my 136. First, 136a. Stress in the preterite indicative is always penultimate. So that's different from all other verbs. So all other verbs instead have final stress in the first and third singular preterite forms. So let's compare, for example, poder, to be able, which is one of these pretérito grave verbs, to perder, which is to lose, which is not one of these verbs. I lost is perdi, with stress on the ending. I could, I was able, I managed is pude. So it's got stress on the root rather than say pudi or podi or anything, right? Likewise, he or she or it lost is perdió with stress on the ending. He or she or it was able or managed is pudo, right? Not podio or pudio or anything like that. So pudo. So you've got stress on the penultimate syllable throughout the paradigm, where all other verbs have final stress in the first singular and third singular of the preterite, right? So I call this the eponymous property. So 136a is the property that Pretérito grave, the term is named after, because grave means to be a word with penultimate stress. Okay. The other thing that is true of all Pretérito grave roots is that verbs that otherwise diphthongize under root stress fail to do so in the relevant forms of the preterite indicative. So you can see this quite readily with the forms that I've given for poder here. So you can see in the first person singular present subjunctive, amongst other forms, you get diphthongization because stress falls on the root. So poder goes to pueda. But this same verb, as you just heard, does not diphthongize, even when the root is stressed in the preterite. So you get pude and pudo with exactly the same monophthong as you get in pudieron, right? Where stress is not on the root. So those two properties are true throughout them for all of them. The other properties that listed on the next page, but what I'm going to do here is leave the screen as it is so that you can see the shading, and I'm going to talk through what the shading means because that's what's described on the next page. So the Pretérito grave verbs are subdivided into different groups based on important quirks of segmental phonology that they exhibit. So there are four roots that take ub, spelled UV or UB, in the pitaforms. These are the ones in yellow shading here. And I discussed those in the context of heteroclasis in the previous video covering Appendix A of the handout. Most of the other roots have a high vowel in the root of the pitaforms, regardless of whether there's a high vowel there in the rest of the paradigm. And these are the verbs that are in orange shading here. So here we've got poder, pudieron, querer, quisieron, saber, supieron. Right. And vacuously, reducir becomes redujeron. It still covers the generalization that you've got a high vowel here, even though that's true of the stem in that particular verb. That is the stem that you see in other verb forms, the infinitive, and so on. Finally, of the roots that exhibit a velar alternation in the present tense, right? So these are the verbs in blue and pink shading in this column. So what you can see here is poner, to put, ponga, first person's present subjunctive, hacer or hacer, to do, haga, venir, venga, that is to come, and the relevant first person singular present subjunctive form, decir or decir, diga, reducir, to reduce, reduzca or reduzca, right? And then traer, to bring, traiga, right? So those verbs that have a velar that turns up in parts of the present tense, including this particular subjunctive present tense form, and all the present subjunctive forms, in fact. Of those, a subset of them show a velar fricative and yod deletion in the pitaforms, and that's in purple shading here. So the Fien vowel in third person plural preterite forms diphthongizes to yeah, as we've seen. And in the purple shaded verbs here, what we see is that the appearance of a velar fricative in the pitaforms correlates with deletion of the yod of that diphthong. So we get dijeron, redujeron, and trajeron, and not dijeron, redujeron, and trajeron. And that can't be the result of an automatic phonological alternation, because sequences of the velar fricative and yod are tolerated in other cases. So we have verbs, for example, like escoger, which means to choose. The third person plural preterite indicative of that verb is escogieron, right, with the velar followed by the yod. So there's something special about this velar that turns up in the pitaforms that's responsible somehow for the yod deletion here, right? And however, the appearance of that velar and the apparently resulting deletion of the yod is not found with all verbs that exhibit a velar in the present in parts of the present tense paradigms. In particular, bonga for I put present subjunctive corresponds to pusieron, not pusjeron or pujeron or anything like that. Likewise, aga, hicieron, right? No velar there, no yod deletion. Likewise, venir has venga, but not benjeron or anything like this. It's binjeron, right? Okay. And that's the distinction between the blue and pink shading here. So the blue shaded ones have a velar alternation in the present in parts of the present tense paradigm, but no velar in the pitaforms, and apparently correspondingly no yod deletion. The verbs that appear in red, pink here have a velar both in those parts of the present tense paradigm. It's a velar stop. And they also have a velar in the preterite forms, but it's a fricative. It's a velar fricative represented by the orthographical J here. And those verbs have yod deletion in the pitative forms. So that's a characterization of the puzzles here. And I've got a sketch of what I have in mind here in the remainder of this little appendix. And you can see Appendix E for relevant rules of exponents, although not all of the relevant phonological rules have been LaTeXified yet, so they don't appear. But here's basically what I have in mind. So morphosyntax-wise, this is in my 138. The idea will be that all Pretérito grave roots have, in addition to their normal conjugation class features, a feature plus grave, named mnemonically. 138b, in addition, the vowel raising subclass have the feature plus VR, mnemonically named, and the OOV class all have B as part of the syntactic structure. So that part comes from lexical decomposition. And there's going to be a kind of lexical decomposition involved in implementing 138b2, but it's just a decomposition of root and verbalizer that's relevant there. There's some special prosodic phonology in the sense that it has to do with the timing tier and the metrical grid. So this is 138. The feature plus grave, when it occurs in a structure also containing the feature complex minus pres plus fin, so the piter, the morphosyntactic part of piter, indexes a cophonology featuring the following additional rules which apply in the order shown. And there's, in fact, if you look in Appendix E, one additional rule, which is a generalization of a rule that's used elsewhere as well, that I'll talk about when we talk about Appendix E in the next video. But anyway, the two prosodic phonology related rules that are keyed to this grave feature are empty CV stripping, which applies before the rules of accent assignment and strips out unfilled any sequence of an unfilled C followed by an unfilled V. This derives the fact that otherwise diphthongizing verbs don't diphthongize when the root is stressed in the relevant forms, right? So why do we get poder, pueda, but then pude rather than puede? It's because of this, right? And then finally, there's the thing that derives the eponymous property, which is 139b. All it says here in prose, penultimate stress, form a bisyllabic trochee at the right edge of the phonological word. There's a statement of how to implement that in terms of the adaptation of the Donna Rocca accent calculation system in Appendix E. So this is just informally stated in prose here, but I've restated it using the terminology for calculating accent from earlier in the handout in Appendix E. Okay. And then 140 is the segmental phonology part. 148. The vowel raising class involves the verbalizer being spelled out as a floating plus high minus low feature bundle, which imposes itself on the nearest vocalic melody to its left, vacuously if the stem vowel in question was already high, but non-vacuously otherwise. 140b for floating velars. So the velar alternations, so get decir, diga, reducir, reduzca, traer, traiga, and so on, and hacer, haga, involve floating velars. So there's a velar on the timing on the melodic tier, which isn't linked to the timing tier underlyingly. Now, in the case where you get a velar also in the piter forms, the idea will be that those velars are part of the root, as they are that's true for decir, exducir, and traer, right? For verbs like at least hacer and poner, that same velar will not be part of the root, but instead will be a realization of the verbalizer. It will be like sort of like the default realization of the verbalizer next to those verbs, those verb roots, except when it's beaten by the realization of the verbalizer that's specialized for piter forms mentioned in 148. So basically, ather is underlyingly something like ath, okay? And the verbalizer accompanying the root spells out as gur, a floating gur in the present tense, and that floating gur is stripped out if there's a front vowel immediately after it, and if not, then it will eventually link to the timing tier. In the piter forms though, so in minus present plus finite environments, the verbalizer is instead spelled out as this floating plus I minus low feature bundle, and that ends up changing the internal vowel of the stem. So they get eth or is throughout there, right? Now, that means that there's no floating velar at all in the relevant underlying representations for Pater forms of afer and similar verbs, but there will be a velar still there, a floating velar still there in those forms in the case of those roots where it's those roots where the floating velar is part of the underlying representation of the root rather than the verbalizer. So, and then the idea is that floating velar will, by virtue of a rule that mentions floating velars as opposed to linked velars, delete yod before linking happens, and there'll be a rule as well that ensures that velar surfaces as a fricative rather than a stop, just in case it has a certain floating feature bundle next to it. That is the floating feature bundle mentioned in 140A, right? There are other segmental alternations that you perhaps will have noticed in that table or that you'll know about if you know Spanish. Those all involve latent and/or underspecified consonantal material in the UR of the root or special floating realizations of the verbalizer, as with saber and caber in the present tense. So if I take you back to the table, here's saber, here's caber. So these verbs have a special mid-realization of their stem vowel in those forms where the vowel most immediately following them is plus back, right? So you get saber, but sepa. Another thing to note here is that there's an alternation in the voicing quality of the final bilabial stop here. So it's b in these forms, which gets spirantized, and per in these other forms. So the idea here is that the final obstruent final stop is underspecified for voicing underlyingly. It gets filled in as being minus voice if there's a floating feature bundle immediately to its right underlyingly, and gets filled in as plus voiced otherwise. In the Pretérito grave forms, I've already told you where the floating feature bundle comes in. That's the realization of the verbalizer for the vowel raising class, right? Saber and caber, in addition, have a floating feature bundle that's realized in present tenses, which is stripped out if the next vowel along is minus back. But if it's not stripped out, then it is imposed on the melody in the stem, and that gives you sepa and kepa from underlying S. So saber will be underlying S, A, and then a stop, which is bilabial but underspecified for voicing, and a floating sort of minus low, minus high feature bundle, which is a realization of the present of the verbalizer in the present tense next to those verbs, right? And then the theme vowel, and then the tam marker if there is one, right? And you'll do floating vowel association to establish what the next vowel will be. So it'll either be the theme vowel, which is which is minus back, or it will be the subjunctive marker or the first person singular present indicative marker if that's in there, right? Which will be o or a. In the event that what links is the theme vowel, so that it's minus back, then you'll strip out that floating feature bundle. The rule that assigns minus voice to the stop won't apply. The general rule that assigns it plus voice will apply. There'll be no change to the internal vowel of the stem, and you'll get like sabe or whatever. But in a present subjunctive form, you'll get that floating feature bundle realizing the verbalizer will not be stripped out. You'll get minus voice assigned to the final stop of the root. Melodic imposition will cause the a of the root to raise to and you'll end up with sepa on the surface. That's the idea. This, by the way, and also what I've already said about the vowel raising class, owes quite a lot by way of inspiration to what James Foley says about these forms in his 1965 dissertation. So what he had was the idea that there's, with some of these verbs, a glide increment, like a suffix that Oh, I put my own hand up apparently. A suffix which um let me just see if I can put my hand down. Lower hand, yeah. A suffix which he didn't really know what it was doing there. He didn't really assign a meaning to it, but which was part of the underlying form of these verb forms, and that would undergo a sort of metathesis with the final stem consonant in certain circumstances after sort of inducing changes to the internal vowel. And that is very much that's essentially an SBE style pre-imagining of the notion of a floating feature that docks, right? And Foley's trouble was that that notion hadn't been invented yet, hadn't been put into the context of a well-motivated phonological theory, and also because he had no notion of separating verbalizers from roots, he didn't have a convenient part of an independently motivated syntactic structure that could be the realization of the relevant increment, as he called it. But yeah, I think he essentially had the right idea, even though the tools to implement it as satisfactorily weren't around in his day. But anyway, that's what I've got in mind for the Pretérito grave. It's a little bit more detail in Appendix E, especially with regard to the rules of exponents and some of the relevant phonological rules, but not all of them, which remain to be LaTeXified, but they will eventually. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you.